Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on whichever part of the world you are joining us from in this month's ASBxSEACEN online seminar series. We are very pleased to have Attila Lindner from the UCL in London. But before Attila, let me introduce you my ASB colleague, fellow economist Melati Nunsari, who will be chairing this session with me. Melati will be here, the in-house micro labor expert, hence I will leave most of the questions to her, although I'm sure our fellow economists from the ASB and SEACEN Centre, Ole, Hans and Ellie will have other questions. Before going to Attila, let me just advertise what is coming as part of ASBxSEACEN series. On the 18th of this month, we are going to be returning back to more conventional macro. I mean, last seminar by Mushfiq Mubarak of Yale, and today's they are more, public policy, micro, which we are very happy to have. But at the end of the month, we are back to macro with Shangjin Wei from Colombia on capital flows. Okay. Today's talk is about minimum wage. To me, it is one of these fascinating issues. You can start with what you learned in your undergraduate with that competitive markets, but in economics, as Attila's advisor David Card calls it, this is research. We keep searching for the answer, and answers sometimes change. When you move into something monotonous kind of markets, the results might change, and this is a big issue in the literature, and it's also a big policy issue in the US and all around the world, with declining labor share and everything, how it might or might not relate to minimum wage. And hopefully our speaker Attila Lindner will convince you about the importance of issue, and they will be addressing the issue, or at least finding who are these minimum wage workers by using machine learning is an additional wonderful sort of innovation of the paper. As I said, Attila is an associate professor at UCL, and he has a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley. He published in top journals in our profession, including Quarterly Journal of Economics, a number of papers on minimum wage, cities, and you name it, he has it. Attila, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. And I will give the presenter rights to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
View. Okay, thanks very much for inviting me. Especially delightful to talk about my micro research for a macro audience, and I'm also happy that you are stay up late because of me. It's London time, it's 1 p.m., but it's much later for you. And today I want to talk about this project, which basically want to understand the effect of the minimum wage on the labor markets, and the twist we will have is that we will be using some machine learning techniques to understand the impact of minimum wage. But before to get into the details, let me just have a broad overview why I think economists are really fascinated about minimum wages and what makes it like what makes it I think a particularly interesting topic. And just before that, it's a joint work with where are we? Okay, joint work with Doruk Cengiz, Dube, and David Zentler-Munro. Okay, so there is a great interest for more than a century now understanding the impact of the minimum wage, and this debate is started quite early. at the inception of the federal minimum wage in the United States in 1978, like big scholars like George Stigler, who is basically the kind of the intellectual leader of the Chicago School, and Richard Lester, who I think is much less known, but in the Princeton economists started to debate about the effect of the minimum wages. And very early on, the discussion was about basically the argument on one side, Stigler put down, was that low-wage labor markets are kind of very competitive. It's a homogeneous labor, so those kind of and firms are competing for it. So those kind of assumptions that usually describe the perfect competition world is just probably right. And you know, minimum wage should destroy jobs in this very standard framework, like a textbook framework. And on the other hand, Richard Lester followed a completely different approach, and he just said, okay, let's go to firms and ask them what do they do. Let them, okay, let's suppose you have a wage cost increase. Will you reduce your employment? What will you do? And surprisingly, most of the firms, and if you look at today's data and you ask firms, many firms will say that for small wage increases, they won't really do anything with their employment. This is what in the 1940s, basically Richard Lester found in this survey data, okay? And then, you know, there is this debate with a series of academic papers, and then, you know, just a little bit later, you know, Milton Friedman, another one of the other leaders of the Chicago School, is basically just said, like, look, Richard Lester paper is very nice, but if you want to do economics, we build models, and the models might be describing, might be based on some unrealistic assumptions, but what we should do is not care about these assumptions, you know, like whether they are realistic or not, but we should really care about the predictive power of the theory, and the cumulative model is just perfectly fine, because if you look at the data and the time, it was a time series data on relationship between minimum wage changes and unemployment in the economy, you will find a quite large negative effect on employment. So this just highlight that, you know, even though maybe firms are not really telling you in the survey that they do this way, it doesn't matter. You have to look at the predictive power of the model and this the right answer, that minimum wage destroy jobs. And you know, that was the consensus from the 50s to the 90s, when you know, two great economics, David Carden and Kruger, broke this consensus by a couple of papers where we basically introduced some credible difference in different strategy, and in this basically comparing states which have a minimum wage change to other states which don't have a minimum wage, and they look at the employment effects, and they find like non-negative employment effect, which again, like very much against the prediction of the standard competitive framework. Okay, and probably as you well heard, the initial reaction was quite was not really welcoming. You know, there was lots of skepticism that it's not possible to find it in the data, just because our standard theory of law of demand predict that if you increase the labor cost, there must be a decline in demand. So that must be the problem with the data, the analysis, the shock is not right, blah, 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 blah. You can come up with lots of things. But of course, if you put this together with the earlier discussion, that kind of have a little bit dangerous implications, because on the other hand, you say you don't have to test the assumptions of your model, so you don't have to test whether labor is homogeneous or firms are behaving like profit maximizing. You can just make this in the kind of like unrealistic assumption in the model. But once you find something which is not in line with your model, and you kind of claim that it's a data problem and not the problem with the theory, then you know you get this kind of very weird word which might not be anymore called science. So of course, it's if you argue on one hand that we build models which are simplifying the word, then you have to make sure that the predictions from the model are taken seriously, and you have to have a way to test those predictions, and you have to find a way that you are able to reject the model if it's not coming out from data. And you know, basically, I think Alan Kruger, which basically one of the so we wrote this paper, a special issue for in honor of Alan Kruger for the Journal of Labor Economics, and as you will see, our paper is very much related to the one of the earlier research of Alan Kruger in the mid-90s in the minimum wage context, and he just summarized this whole idea very precisely. So basically, the idea of turning economics into a true empirical science, where core theories can be rejected, is a big revolutionary idea. So basically, in the mid-90s, coming up with some data analysis which is against the prediction of the standard framework was really like negatively received and make lots of backlash. Today is much more accepted that, oh, we find this in the data, then we have to maybe change our way of thinking of the world and not the other way. So this is like basically the introduction. So that's the reason why we really care about the minimum wage is because it's really testing one of the core predictions of how low-wage labor markets operates. And basically, this is one of the most direct tests of testing whether it can be described by perfect competition or we need something else to understand what's going on. And you know, this whole new minimum wage research that you might heard of is basically trying to produce some reduced form evidence on employment and wages by exploiting like exogenous variation, like trying to find exogenous variation in the minimum wages. And one of the leading country where we study this topic is the US. And the reason for that is that in the US, even though it's one country, there are lots of state level variation in the minimum wage. So there are some states which raise the minimum wage and there are other states which doesn't. And this just control like a really nice like a treatment control setup, which basically you can really understand the effect of the policy with much less assumptions than in other countries like in Germany or UK, where you basically have a one nationwide minimum wage shock, and it's kind of difficult to find a good control for what would happen in Germany without the minimum wage change. Okay, and then there are lots of techniques that have been developed, like the two-way effects estimation, where you basically include the state and the year fixed effects and regression by Normark and Washer. It was a very important econometrics at that time, which basically applied in many other contexts, understanding other policies. Then one of the early debates leads to usage of administrative data, which again today is quite standard to trying to use administrative data, but in the 90s it was just quite revolutionary that somebody, the original Karen Kruger paper was a survey. They were criticized that the data might be not representative, and then they went to the administrative data and brought some, much richer evidence to advance their discussion. Then there is this border discontinued design, where you basically look at counties, two sides of the crazy border, where you basically argue that they are very similar and trying to compare very similar areas to each other. It's a much larger scale than it would be possible just exploiting one minimum wage change, like in the original Karen Kruger fast food restaurant paper. But if you look at this literature, even though it's like an enormous advancement, this literature often focusing on specific demographic groups like teens, or very specific sectors like fast food restaurant or restaurants in general. And you might be interested about the effect of the policy on teens, but you can also argue that many cases the policymaker is interested not about the effect of employment change for teens, but the effect on employment changes on overall population of minimum wage workers. Or maybe you are interested on adult population, or you might not interested on the effect of the minimum wage in restaurants. Maybe there's a positive effect in restaurants, but there is a negative effect in other sectors. Then what do I learn from just looking at the restaurants? So most of the researcher, if you want to understand the implications of minimum wage on the labor market, and both the policymaker, you might just want to understand the effect of the minimum wage on the overall employment change. And if you look at this enormous literature and 100 paper, there are very few directly talking about that. And in fact, most of the US literature is really focusing on a specific subgroup, the teens. And why they're focusing on the teens? Because large share of the teen workers are minimum wage workers. So if I'm looking at the employment and wage effect on teens, I will find a positive wage effect and a positive positive wage effect on the teens, and I can look at the employment effect. But if I look at all people, it might be harder to find a positive wage effect on overall population if the minimum wage worker is only a small fraction of the total workforce. But if you're really focusing on teens or sectors like fast food, then you have this issue internal versus external validity. Okay, and just highlighting how important is this. So there is this two survey papers like the Bellman and Wolfson 2014 collecting 30 studies. 17 of them is specifically on teens. So even though they're talking about the effect of minimum wage, they're talking about the effect of minimum wage on teens. In the 9 March 2017, again another survey paper for the low skill employment, 19 out of 13 studies is about teens. So basically it's like really specifically estimating on a specific subgroups, which might be specific interest, but it's also the case that it's not necessarily there's no interesting room. And if you look at overall time, the share of the teens in the economy, you see this basically just show from the 1980s to the 2020, there is a dramatic decline in the share of teens in the workforce. So in the early share of minimum wage workers who are teens, okay, so early 80s, basically like 30% of minimum wage workers were teens. So if you were focusing on teens, you captured a large fraction of the workforce. But if you look at the early 2020, it's already less than 15%, okay, or not less than, it's around 15%. So basically, if you look at the teen employment, you're basically looking at the effect on a population which represents 15% of all minimum wage workers, and it's possible that those teens have very different response to the minimum wage policy than non-teens or prime age adults. So what we kind of try to do to solve this issue, we kind of try to develop a framework which allows you to estimate the effect of minimum wage on larger groups of workers, so all minimum wage workers. And the first approach that we kind of developed is this distributional wage approach, which we published in the Quarterly Journal of Quarterly Journal of Economics. Basically, there we compare basically here you can just summarize in the basic idea. So we take if you take the distribution without the minimum wage, the red line, and then you take the distribution after the minimum wage, the blue line, what you will see, there is some missing jobs below the minimum wage, which disappear as a result of the wage increase. So these are the jobs which disappearing, and there will be some excess jobs which just pop up, after the minimum wage increase. And the missing jobs is a number of jobs that affected by the minimum wage. How much excess jobs appearing after the minimum wage increase at the minimum wage and slightly above it is basically the jobs that created there. If you add up the two sum, you will get the employment change. Okay, and basically that's the basic idea. And then you can empirically implement this idea, exploiting state level variation, and look at what's happening in the distribution. And then you will find after average minimum wage change in the US states, there is a missing jobs at the bottom, and there's an excess jobs at the top, at and above the minimum wage, and there is not much changing at the top. Okay, and this is basically the preference distribution based approach. You can sum up this number of jobs, you will see it's close to zero, slightly positive, and then you can use this as estimating the effect on all wage workers who are below the minimum wage, like a low wage worker. So basically zooming into the bottom of the wage distribution. So basically, this is kind of the idea of this, is that you really localize and zoom into the part of the wage distribution where minimum wage is a meaningful effect, and then you want to understand the employment changes for them. And then the advantage of that approach is, first of all, you can get a first stage wage effect for workers who are every workers at the bottom wage distribution. That might be much harder if you wouldn't zoom in that particular group. Then you can also look at the effect on the upper of the wage distribution, what's happening, and that kind of you can infer that if there is a large change in the upper part, then you should be cautious how to interpret this, because that might reflect the presence of other policies as well. So you have to be cautious. And then just not adding to the employment change, the small changes of it happening at the distribution, you kind of decrease the noise and increase the precision of the estimates. So that's the approach which we have developed. This is a very good approach for understanding the employment effect of the minimum wage. But there is a problem that if you want to go beyond and you want to understand the effect on other outcomes like unemployment rate or participation rate or job-to-job flows, or maybe some outcomes that some outcomes like getting healthcare insurance in the US, for instance, then you cannot use the distributional based approach, and that's why we kind of wrote this follow-up paper, which basically which have a different, very similar idea by localizing and focusing on employment changes on workers who are likely to be at the bottom of the distribution, but not directly look at the distribution, but trying to use a prediction model to predict who is a minimum wage worker, and then understanding the employment changes of those workers. Okay? So basically, we will cut the general problem. So we want to understand the effect of minimum wage on overall low wage employment to two steps. one step. The first step, what we want to do is basically we select group of workers who are likely to minimum wage workers, and the way we do is basically a standard classification problem. You want to say that, you know, if I observe these demographic characteristics, you are likely to be a minimum wage worker, okay? And if your demographic characteristic different, then I might say that, oh, you are very unlikely to be a minimum wage worker, okay? And so this is exactly that a prediction problem. I want to use some variable of x and some function to predict you are a minimum wage worker, and then I would want to classify worker that is highly likely to be minimum wage workers, and other workers that are less likely to be minimum wage workers, okay? And once we have this classification, we can just look at the event study and look at the, you know, what's happening with workers who we classified likely to be minimum wage workers, and what happened in treated states versus control states where there was no minimum wage change, but they also highly likely to be a minimum wage worker, okay? So basically it's a standard difference in difference, but now we're looking at the workers who are highly likely to be minimum wage workers according to our prediction model. And of course, you can look at employment as before. You can look at wages as before. So this is, we already got the demographic based approach, which I just talked very briefly. But you can also get other outcomes. I can calculate that, oh, this is highly likely, these workers are highly likely to be affected by the minimum wage. What happened there? Job flows. What happened there? Unemployment rate. What happened their participation rate? What happened, like all these other outcomes that would be very hard to get from just a distributional based approach. So I think this idea is not, you know, this idea is not, it's coming out in many econometric approaches. So if you know, you have the, I mean, here we just mentioned two, you know, if you do a standard 2 SLS IV strategy, you know, at the step first, you want to have an exogenous variable and you want to predict using that exogenous variation, the endogenous variable, and then the second stage, you basically use a causal inference based on the relationship between predicted endogenous variable and the variable of interest. You also have the similar idea in the propensity score, that basically the stage first, you kind of predict the propensity to be affected by the policy, like in fact, it's very similar idea here, and then estimate the treatment effect using the propensity score matching. Okay, so this is somewhat similar idea. We kind of a little bit go a step further and applying this to okay, so it turns out that this idea is not, we are not the first who have this idea, and Carl and Kruger, in his very famous book in 1995 on means and measurement, they proposed this idea, in fact, which drew our attention by some of the referees who referred our distributional based approach, but basically the profession doesn't really pick up this approach and doesn't really apply in any other papers. But basically they argue that, you know, you can do this prediction, you apply a probability model, and basically they justify that, you know, like if you have a certain specification, that will be a good predictor. And you know, they argue that, you know, you cannot throw in all the kind of X variables into the regression, because then you have this overfitting issue that, you know, there are variables which in your sample where you're trying to do the prediction will be working very well, okay, but then if you move another sample, they will not work at all. Okay, so this kind of the overfitting problem in machine learning or any kind of prediction problem. So you want to avoid that. So you want to regularize the model. You want to say that I'm only including variables in the prediction which are important enough, so they are improving the model enough to the performance of prediction model enough. And basically what they do, they do this regularization in their mind. That's what we call regularization, that you only want to include the explanatory variables in the prediction model that are really important and improve the precision, and those variables which have just a small impact on the prediction performance you want to get rid of. So they do this regularization in their mind. Okay, it's in the 90s. We're talking about the 90s. It's not like still in the big data world. It's not like machine learning was something that people talked about all around. They do this regularization by trial and error. And of course, you have to be a good economist to, you know, understanding the labor markets to be able to do it rightly. Okay. So our twist to this, so instead of having this kind of subjective-based regularization, we can apply these machine learning techniques which we have developed since then, and you know, apply different prediction models like simple logistic, elastic net, random forest, gradient boosting. I will talk a little bit briefly about the basic ideas about them, and try to predict who is likely to be affected by the minimum wage. And you basically these algorithms are you can just apply them. You know, you give them the data, you give them a prediction problem, you basically run the code, they give you the results, and then you can see their performance, and you don't have to know anything about you don't have to be David Card or Alan Kruger to successfully do it. Okay, and we basically successfully able to capture most of the minimum wage workers in our high recall group, which I will talk a little bit about. But the basic idea that once we have this prediction, we will kind of do a difference in difference, where we compare the effective minimum wage on high probability groups of people which are very likely to minimum wage workers, and also groups of high recall, where you basically cover a large fraction of the minimum wage workers. And again, the key improvement is that we go beyond the wage and employment and looking at outcomes like unemployment, labor force participation, part-time work, or self-employed. So why we think it's important to go beyond the employment effect is just you know, it's just following very simple framework and highlight this. So here I kind of have a model where you basically have a labor for participation. So basically individuals, I draw kind of a random value of being non-participating on the labor market. And then once you decide, and this is one state of the world, the other state is that you enter to the labor market, and with some probability, you will be unemployed. Then you can get the unemployment benefit times with the probability of lambda, which can depend on the minimum wage. You will get a new job, and then you will be employed, and then you get the value of employment minus the value of unemployment. And if you are employed, then you know you get the value of employment, the minimum wage, so it's a low wage worker. Then there is a job destruction rate, which again might be affected by the policy. And if your job is destroyed, then you get to unemployment, and again you move on unemployment and search for a job, and you might find. So the minimum wage itself, you know, might potentially affect the value of employment through the effect on getting higher wage, but it also can affect through job destruction and through job creation, you know, all these variables. Okay, and then you basically decide to participate if your value of unemployment, so this guy, is larger than the value of non-employment. Okay, so now what you can see in this very simple framework with no worker heterogeneity, that you know the minimum wage can affect lots of things, employment, lambda, delta, but whether it's improving the welfare or not will depend whether the participation rate increasing. Okay, and if basically the labor for participation fall, then basically you will have a negative welfare effect, and if labor for participation increasing, then it in this model you will be for sure you can conclude that the minimum wage improves welfare. Okay, so basically in that very simple framework, like participation rate is what you want to look at if you are interested about the welfare implication. Of course, if there's heterogeneous framework, then there will be some people who are exactly on the margin. For those workers, you know, it's exactly the participation you want to look at. For those which are not on the margin on participation, there it will be trickier to figure out the welfare consequences. But you know, at least in this very simple framework, it just tells you that you want to look at the participation rate, and you know, we want to estimate whether minimum wage change participation in the labor market. Okay, so the two steps we will do. Part one is predicting minimum wage workers. Let me just check the time. Perfect. Okay, so we will basically predict minimum wage workers at part one, and the second part we will use this predicted minimum wage workers and look at the effect of the policy on them. Okay, so this is so predicting with the minimum wage worker is a prediction model. So you want to have like Y, which is in this framework we will try to look at like whether worker is earning within 175% of the minimum wage before the policy change. Okay, so we will take like all workers before the policy change, and we try to predict that you are 125% below the minimum wage. And then you want to use like a F function, and the F function is what the machine learning will give us. Like it can be a very complicated tree or something, or it can be just a logistic linear function. So it can be anything, and that's what the machine learning tool about. It's hard to get the right F. and then we will plug in axes. Axes will be something that we observe in the data, but it cannot be affected by the policy. Okay, so basically age, is fixed. Even if the minimum wage higher or lower, your age in the population will be not affected. Then education is, we are looking at relatively short-term effects, so we don't get into account that if you raise the minimum wage, then over time, 10 years in time, you might change education. Immediately after the policy, there won't be like a big effect on whether you are the fraction of people with high school education. Then we have gender. Again, the policy itself has no direct effect on it. Then race categories, Hispanic origin, mental status, veteran status. So all these things, which we kind of saying that probably we can use it to predict who is a minimum wage worker, also characteristics, but it's kind of fixed axis. So it's not like a policy itself can have an effect on axis, and this is crucial for us. I'll tell you that the basic idea is coming from this current Kruger 1995 approach, where basically they use this linear probability model, and they say like, okay, let's include three-way interaction between teen, non-white, and gender, three-way interaction variables between young adults, non-white, and gender, and etc., etc. They argue that this is the best prediction model, and then basically they compare the effect of the minimum wage workers on high probability group and on and then the bottom 50% low probability group. Okay, so we basically do this exercise, but instead of having like this subjective judgment on which variables we should do, we will really use these techniques developed in the last 20 years to understand which variable to pick. Okay, and so which are these techniques that we are exploring here? So basically all the basic machine learning tools. And so we start with the tree. So what does the tree is doing? So the tree is the following. So basically we are talking about how we find this f. Okay, and what the tree is doing, split the data at the beginning to 2. Okay, and then basically split the data in 2, and then it say how many people on the left are minimum wage workers, how many people are found in left as minimum wage workers, and how many people on the right found as minimum wage workers. Okay, if you are randomly split, first one, then you just get like half right, half left. That's a prediction model which doesn't have any predictive power. Now the data do lots of splits, goes through the algorithm like all of the splits that it possibly imagine, and then it picks the split that maximizing that on the one side you have a maximum of minimum wage workers that you can achieve, and the other is the minimum of the minimum wage workers that you can achieve. Okay, and then basically you can do it one level, and then you can go with the remaining data in a new level, and then again split, find the best split. Okay, and then in that new level you can go again, and you can have different levels of the tree, and then you basically kind of trying to predict what's going on. So if you apply this into our context, and you apply a category variable for age, then basically the tree first says like you should divide the data first by age. So those who age 25 should go to the left, age 25 should go to the right. Then you again divide by age on the right hand side. And if you are age below 19, then we apply you are a minimum wage worker. So basically this tree method will find the teens as a minimum wage worker. And then if you are age 19, you will say you are not a minimum wage worker. And again, here on the left, you basically then you cut by schooling, but in both cases you will say it's aligned to minimum wage worker. Okay, so basically a two-level tree, if you apply, basically it will give you that it find the teenage workers. Okay, so this is like the basic standard tree technique that you can come up, and it's kind of it's well understood that this strategy is a little bit weak learner, so it doesn't really find the best way to cut the data. Okay. So then the second is like expanding this tree idea basically is the random forest. Okay, and what's happening in the random forest, and I'm not going to have like a whole lecture about this, but basically what you have, you first bootstrap a sample, and then you basically grow a tree. Okay, then you find which is the best way to cut. Then you bootstrap another sample, and then you again draw a tree, and that tree will be slightly different because it's a different sample. And then again, you do it many times, and once you do it like 1,000 times, you basically average out, and you get this kind of cut of the data, which is average of these trees. Okay, and basically this kind of bootstrapping process will help you to kind of deal with this overfitting issue you know, basically minimizing, basically you want to get the right people, and you want to minimize the variance that you want to really find the right people and minimize the variance of the approach. So the second, this is random forest. So the third approach is a gradient boosted tree, which is kind of following a different idea. So basically what it do is basically developing a sequential approach. So first it finds a tree, you know, it split the data separately as before for the basic tree. Okay, so it split the data to two as in a tree. But then basically you take all the workers who are misclassified. Okay, so you basically, there will be workers who you classify right, and there will be no misclassified people, and then you again split the trees on the residual, on the misqualified people. And then again, you take the next step, you take those who are misqualified in the second step, and you again classify them to minimum wage and non-minimum wage worker, and then you know, you take the residual again, the misclassified, and do it step and step and step. Okay. So basically, like you always, instead of having like all the time in the sample, you always working on those which are misclassified. Okay, and then you basically apply this algorithm until you repeat this algorithm until you stop somewhere. Okay, so this is the gradient boosted tree, and the fourth standard approach is very similar to the logistic regression applied by the Karen Kruger, except, you know, instead of having a subjective judgment whether you should have this particular variable in the regression or not, you basically just learn the logistic regression with the region-less penalties. So this penalties imply that if you have a variable, that's a penalty. So there you have a penalty. You want to minimize the number of variables in the regression. Okay, and then basically the lesser regression does it for that. So basically it started a very rich model where we have four-way interactions, and then basically the regularization test, so that basically the model is basically taking this out, a particular variable. If the fit is not changing a lot, then it says it's better, because, you know, more variables is penalized. And, you know, if you take out something which is super important, then it does say you shouldn't do it. Okay, and so basically you do this approach, and then we basically end up like those variables which are the most important ones. Okay, so we'll apply all these different machine learning tools, and we'll compare the performance of those different machine learning tools. So basically the data that we will use is the CPS-MORG data. You know, is the labor force survey in the United States. Basically used all periods which is available between 1979 and 2019. And given that it's kind of quite crucial for us to be able to predict your wage, we will only focus today on workers without imputed wages. Then basically we have a trained data set where we basically train the machine learning, the prediction algorithm, and then we will use a test sample where you basically trying to look at, okay, in the trained sample, I use the machine learning to maximize the prediction. In the test sample, I will apply the prediction and see how well is the performance. Is it how many minimum wage workers I was able to predict to be minimum wage worker, how many mistakes I made in my classification. Okay, and basically use the pre-minimum wage changes as a period to do this exercise. So basically, you know, usually the way we compare performance of different prediction is calculating on the one hand the precision, and the other hand the recall. And I will define this objects very quickly. And then what we usually draw the precision recall curves to understand the performance. So to explain you through what you see here, let me describe these objects first. Okay, so the precision will be given that how many workers I predicted to be a minimum wage workers, what fraction of it are truly a minimum wage workers. Okay, so basically you have precision telling you 60% or 80%. That would tell you that the group of workers where I said these are minimum wage workers, 80% of them indeed are minimum wage workers. So the thing that we want is to be 100%. Okay, because 100% means that all of the minimum wage workers I said is minimum wage, they are for sure minimum wage workers. Okay, so that's the precision, how precise I'm kind of targeting the group. So the other interesting object is the recall rate. So if I take all the minimum wage workers in the economy, what fraction of them are able to capture? Okay. And so basically what you can, it's telling you that, if there are 100 minimum wage workers in the economy, my prediction model based on basically able to capture 2, then it's basically 2%. If I'm able to capture 50 of them, it's 50%. Okay. So basically it's how many workers I can, how many true minimum wage workers I recall. And of course, what you can see is the precision and recall curves. They're usually a trade-off between precision and recall. Okay, so maybe I have a prediction model that is really precise. Like I'm sure that these guys are minimum wage workers because they are teen, they are low educated, they are living in a low wage state. Like all this information I know about it, it's 100% is minimum wage workers. But at the same time, very few of them in the data. So then you will have a really high precision. You will know for sure that you say like minimum wage worker, like minimum wage worker, but very low recall because you only capture a small fraction of all minimum wage workers. So what you see in these curves is basically looking at the performance of the prediction model. So if you increase the recall, it means I'm able to capture more and more workers who are truly minimum wage. But at the same time, I kind of including more and more workers who are less and less likely to minimum wage workers, okay? So that's why you see this kind of negative slope in the precision recall curves. And the different colors and different lines in this is all of them is a separate machine learning algorithm, okay? So basically the boosted tree is the black line, which is basically the best prediction model because at given recall rate, so if I want to capture 40% of the minimum wage worker, basically it's able to capture by around a 50% precision, okay? If you go, for instance, 100% recall, that model will be that I say everybody's minimum wage workers. Then of course, for sure, I will have all the minimum wage workers in my sample, but the precision will be very low because everybody is predicted to be minimum wage worker. Okay, and then you can see the different models. The random forest is the blue line. The tree is this purple line, and then the linear Karen-Kruger model. And then we have the basic logistic where we just include variables in the regression like education, age without an interaction, and the elastic net is the other machine learning algorithm. So just to see the difference, we can take the difference between the best machine learning tool, the boosted tree, and the rest, and basically that's what you will see. Okay. So basically at the given recall rate, these are the difference between the best prediction model boosting and the model and the prediction model that's showed here. And then you can see that the basic logistic doesn't go very well. It's the data say that if you want to capture minimum wage workers, you can get a lot by interacting some of the basic variables with like interacted education with race and these kind of things. But then, it basically shows that once you get to Karen-Kruger, the Karen-Kruger in the 90s, not learning anything about the minimum wage machine learning, they get a pretty good prediction model. Like, you get a little improvement by applying the most modern techniques like a boosted tree or random forest, but that's not like enormous. And, the random forest and the boosted tree is almost the same. So it's working really well. And the tree, it's not going well, especially at the top. Okay, so you can also compare, basically we have this prediction model. You can also compare to the traditional approach where you say, okay, I'm looking at the effect of the minimum wage on a specific subgroups, like high school less than 30. Okay. And you can calculate for that subgroup the recall rate, what fraction of minimum wage workers are there, and then you can also calculate the precision rate. And you can see that, usually you get like a much lower recall rate and a much lower precision rate. And if you are talking about a 40%, even like a best group, you usually see in the literature, at most you get 40% minimum wage workers. So a large fraction of minimum wage workers are not covered. So what we will do, we'll apply like around 75% recall rate. So we will capture a much larger workforce. And then here we just show kind of so if you boost the tree model, you can calculate what the influence of specific predictors on the prediction. And then you can see age is pretty important. So it's important to have age. So age is a good predictor of your minimum wage workers, but there are lots of other roles for the other factors as well, like education, gender, and marital status. Okay, so once we have the prediction and we say like, okay, we can predict everybody, what's the probability that this particular guy is a minimum wage worker, we can just study the effect of the minimum wage on them. And basically we'll follow the Cengiz et al. Paper, where we basically exploit state level variation of minimum wage between 1979 and 2019. We are all together, we only take like larger events where there's at least 5% change in the minimum wage. And basically we are ending up like 172 events. And we basically estimate the change in various outcomes. So of individual I at time t. Basically we'll have a dummy which shows that there was a minimum wage change in that particular state where individual I lives at time t. We kind of interact this, we're kind of looking at like it's like an event study, so we're looking at a few years before and a few years after, and then we can include some state-specific controls or controls if there are smaller minimum wage changes than 5%. Then we have a state fixed effect and a time fixed effect in the regression. Okay, and then we basically will calculate as well the on-wage employment elasticity, so basically the percentage change in employment with respect to the percentage change in minimum wage divided by the percentage change in average wage divided by the percentage change in minimum wage. So this is basically the key results of a couple of graphs that we have is the key results of the paper. So this is showing the percentage change in wages that we get from this exercise when we run this regression on between 1979 and 2019. And basically we can run this regression by setting a different predicted probability threshold. Okay, so in the x-axis, so each of this is like each of this dot, which is almost like continuous, is a separate regression. And then what we do, we kind of in one regression we set the threshold at 0.38, so we only include those workers whose predicted probability to being a minimum wage is more than 38%. And then we basically run the regression, we get the coefficients, we average out in the post period, and basically we plot what we get. So what we will see that for those workers who are really highly likely, so more than 38%, more than 38% more, their predicted probability of being a minimum worker is more than 38%, are basically experiencing a 3% increase on average across this 170. How many events we have? 170. Okay, and then you can look at not just this 38%, but you can go down. Like let's take all the workers who have predicted probability above 24% here. Then you basically still get a pretty good 3% increase. But once you increase the predicted probability, this predicted the wage increase obviously goes down because you include more and more workers who are not the minimum wage workers, and so they shouldn't be affected by the policy directly. So their wage is not increasing. By including them in the sample, you see that there is a decline in the wage increase. Okay, and so but in the paper we kind of say like, okay, these are the really high probability group of people where basically you can see there is a recall rate of 35%, so it's 35% minimum wage workers. So 60% of these workers are minimum wage workers. And then we can also look at them where we have a higher fraction of minimum wage workers, 75%, but at the same time, the precision is somewhat lower. So they're only among the groups which we classify, only 38% is minimum wage workers, and the rest is non-minimum wage workers. Okay, so you can do the same exercise for wage that we then described for wage on employment, unemployment participation. And you know what you can see here, that even though there's a significant positive wage effect, there's not much going on in terms of employment. The employment is independently where you are looking at, it's really just close to zero. And then, in unemployment, if anything, is a very slight decrease, but it's not significant, but it's basically flat. And, the participation is very, very flat. Okay, so if you look at that for different high probability or high recall limit, you don't find any evidence for change in participation rate. So then you can also look at the effect over time. So you're exploiting the time in nature, the event study stuff. So if you look at the wage, you see there's a clear increase in wages. -1 is when the, sorry, 0 is when the minimum wage hike took place. So there's a clear increase in the minimum wage when the minimum wage hike takes place. The minimum wage hike takes place. On the other hand, in employment, you basically find nothing. Basically, unemployment may be a slight decrease, but it's not really big. And again, in participation, there is no effect over time. Okay, so it's not like there might be short-term effect or long-term, but if you even look at 5 years out, there is no evidence for change in participation rate or unemployment rate or employment in response to minimum wage. Why? For this high predicted, probably high recall group where we capture 75% of the workforce, we find a clear wage increase in response to the policy. Okay, so this is just a table format of what I just showed you. Basically, you have this high probability group and high recall group, which I already showed the graphically. You can calculate the wage effect. The employment, unemployment participation is close to 0. You can also calculate the employment loss with respect to wage. It's basically around 0.3. It's positive. In standard labor demand model, I would say it's negative because if you increase the wages, demand have to decrease. Here it's positive, and then the standard errors you can rule out like pretty. You cannot rule out 0. So it's possible that the minimum wage has no employment effect, but you can rule out medium or even medium-sized negative disemployment effects. So definitely much lower employment effect than what you would get any standard competitive framework if you apply the parameter values that people often use. Then again, this is the high probability. So this is the high likely minimum wage workers. So this is where you may say like, okay, these are really affected by the policy. They may have negative effect, but you don't see anything. The same with the high recall group. There is not much happening. Here you already capture 75% of all the minimum wage workers. There's a clear wage effect, but nothing happening in employment, unemployment, or participation. And then the low probability group is again like using it as a placebo check. So these are low probability groups where happen to be high wage workers. Now the minimum wage, it's not clear that you should see a large disemployment or wage effects on that group. If I would see a large wage effect, for instance, I would be a little bit worried that we're capturing some kind of state-specific effects that take place besides the minimum wage change, and I would be worried that this contaminant might be the estimate at the bottom, but this doesn't seem to be the case. So the low probability groups, so those workers which doesn't to be minimum wage, which not supposed to be, which are unlikely to be minimum wage workers, we don't see any differential employment or wage effects. Okay, and then you can look at the effect on other outcomes, like what is the self-employment share of the high probability group or the high recall group, and you don't find any evidence. You find some decrease in part-time share for the high probability group. Okay, so that means that there are more full-time jobs after the minimum wage, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence on overtime share in those groups. And then you can also look at like specific groups, like as I said, we might be interested about all workers, which maybe the policymaker or macroeconomist would say like, I'm mainly interested how many jobs will be destroyed or not destroyed by the minimum wage. Then I want to use all workers. But maybe you are, as a policymaker, you are also interested that those maybe some of the disadvantaged group of the people, like Black and Hispanic or female or less than high school, are not really negatively affected. Okay, so it's kind of, so you can apply exactly the same machine learning algorithm as I just described you. I mean, if you wish, you can have a separate machine learning, and we tried it, but it didn't improve much. So when they decided to use the original machine learning algorithm, but just focusing on a specific group, like in the second column, we just only look at employment and wage effects for Black and Hispanic. Third column for only female, teen, and less than high school and high school. High school and less. No, okay, less than high school, and this is the high school. I think this is high school, yeah. And you basically everywhere is close to 0, positive point estimate. Sometimes the estimate is more noisy, but there is no evidence in employment except the second column, the Black and Hispanic. And there you kind of find like a negative, very imprecisely estimated effect. And this is kind of interesting in the sense that it's not significantly different from 0 because it's not precisely estimated. but the point estimate is negative, and in fact is a medium-sized estimate, and you cannot really even exclude large negative effects for the Black and Hispanic. So this is kind of an open question. Like, I mean, the data that we have here is not enough to tell what's happening with the Black and Hispanic, but it's possible that they are negatively affected by the policy change. All right, let me summarize what I think the key takeaways from this exercise. So first of all, I presented you some evidence on minimum wages, and basically the evidence that this two-step procedure gives us is that there doesn't seem to be any negative effect on unemployment rate or employment or labor force participation. In fact, in the paper, we're also looking at job-to-job flows and all this kind of stuff, and that doesn't seem to be, even if you look at like the high probability or high recall, that doesn't seem to be the case that minimum wage has a substantial negative effect on that. And it's kind of interesting because many of the search theory and search models are really predict that there should be large marginal change on these outcomes, and in the data we just unable to find anything that predicted by these search models. So in that sense, like, it doesn't seem to us that search effort is changed a lot in response to minimum wage, and the marginal workers who are at the participation margin or doesn't seem to be affected by this policy work. In fact, in one prediction framework, we also try to predict your marginal worker. So you're in the participation threshold, and then trying to see whether we find differential participation and employment effect, and we don't find anything on them. And then the inframarginal workers, of course, at the same time, probably better because they have higher wages and no employment change. So there are some evidence for increasing full-time work, and there are some areas of concern, like the Black and Hispanic is which you highlighted. It's not that we can say there is a negative effect on them because we are facing a statistical power issue, but it's possible that they face a quite negative disemployment effect, and this should be further studied. And I think for the more general takeaways outside of this minimum wage context, I think is that this kind of machine learning algorithm can be used not just to evaluate the effect of the minimum wage, but also other interesting policies. So basically, you can really use this machine learning to identify workers most affected by a given policy. Today it was minimum wage, but you can have like other policies like EITC, welfare programs, or any kind of other programs. And then you can apply this prediction, and maybe you can also look at like you can move across data sets. So maybe you have a prediction model of who is a minimum wage workers in using the CPS, and then you have a data where you observe the same demographic variables, but you don't have wage information. But in that data, you observe health benefits, and or whether this guy has health insurance. And you can look at like, okay, is a high probability guy has a change in the probability having a health insurance. So this is kind of one application that we don't explore in the paper, but it's kind of a straightforward follow-up work could be done on that. And then you can also, basically that's applied to different data with no informed wages, and you can also study other policies like our approach, I think, has kind of some connection to this standard grouping estimator, a la Blanda, Duncan, and McGeer, where they basically say like look specific demographic groups and whether there's a change in policy in that tax rate in that demographic groups, and then look at like what's happening in the labor supply. And it's basically the same idea, except you don't pre-specify the demographic groups. So you don't say like, oh, I want to have a specific demographic groups, but you say like, okay, let's have a prediction model, predict that you're affected by a particular policy change, like a tax reform, and then use that like, okay, what's the effect of the tax reform on workers who are likely to be affected by the tax policy change, and look at also the effect on workers who are less likely to be affected by the tax policy change, and then basically you can understand the effect of the tax policy by applying this approach. Okay, let me finish here and attention.
Attila, thank you very much for your presentation. There are a number of questions from the audience, but before I ask some of them, may I sort of, at least about the beginning of your presentation when you were introducing this debate. There is a very nice interview with David Card with the Minneapolis Fed's Region magazine. There is a very interesting experience that David Card cites when he was presenting his earlier paper with Alan Kruger at the University of Chicago. He says that some people called him a traitor to the profession. Anyway, I always found that interesting. Attila, the first question was your distributional graph. If you do not mind going to that first figure, the question was a clarification. If my understanding was the people below the minimum wage, the new minimum wage, and above, the only reason we are having that blue bit is because some people can no longer be below that new minimum wage. Am I right?
Yeah. So so the blue bit is just telling you that some workers who were below the minimum wage may be kept, and you pay the higher wage, and those are ending up as an excess mass. No, if you are laid off, you are disappearing from the wage distribution. You are going to unemployment. You're basically moving here.
Exactly. Another question, given this is a macro crowd, we are all central bankers, is there a role for state level business cycles where those minimum wage changes were introduced?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because that's like exactly the point, I think, to study the not just the bottom of the wage distribution, but showing the effects throughout the whole wage distribution. And I think the argument is that, okay, so if there's a business cycle, we should see that there are some positive effect at the top of the wage distribution as well. And in fact, if you look at some studies that recently, like many people citing in the minimum wage debate in the United States, is one of this big study on the Seattle minimum wage change. And so in the Seattle minimum wage change, they kind of follow a similar approach where they're looking at the effect of the policies throughout the whole wage distribution. And what they find is that there's lots of jobs disappearing at the bottom, but there is also like an enormous job creation at the top. Okay, so basically there's this big increase at the top of the wage distribution, much higher above the minimum wage. And then there is a clear evidence there that in Seattle, in parallel with introducing the minimum wage, there was also a boom. The economy was really booming. It was on the business cycle on the top. And then it's possible that the boom affected the top of the wage distribution, like jobs like tech jobs and all this kind of stuff. But it might trickle down as well on the bottom of the distribution, and then it's very hard to separate these two things. Like maybe if there are more high-tech engineers in Seattle, then you will see that there are less low-wage restaurants and high-wage restaurants coming into business. Or maybe the business prices, the housing prices go up and low-quality businesses go bust because of the business cycle or because of this boom, which has nothing to do with the minimum wage. So that's why I think it's really informative, on the one hand, to put and show the people the evidence on what's happening in the upper part of the wage distribution. And we can also do this in a machine learning approach by looking at the effect on people who are unlikely to be minimum wage workers. Because maybe you find some effects on that, and you have a theory, because there might be some spillovers on that type of workers from labor substitution. But you can calculate, for instance, how big is this, how big changes you think would predicted by your model, and if it's too big or too small. I mean, if it's too big, then you can say like, oh, maybe it's just something else as well took place at the time of the minimum wage, and then I have to be very careful how I interpret the changes at the bottom of wage distribution. So business cycle is definitely something that we very seriously think that it can be a major issue, and I think one advantage of this approach of focusing like a low probability group or at the upper part of a distribution is really directly talking about this concern.
I understand. Thank you. I guess the thing there is probably some self-selection. I guess very few states would introduce an increase in minimum wage in the middle of a recession. I guess we wouldn't get some kind of randomness in data. Maybe.
Yes, yes, that's another question about, you know, whether there's heterogeneity in the impact of the minimum wage, whether it was introduced in a boom period or in a recession. You know, there are, I mean, I think the professional view is that probably there is, but there is really very hard to find good evidence on that. So when we look at the 100 and so what we do in the paper, we look at like the 170 evidence that we have, the separate minimum wage. It's 172 separate minimum wage changes, and you know, most of them are in positive, you know, when there is a normal time in the economy, but there are some which you have a recession, in fact. And then you can look at what's happening there, and it's just we don't find any unusual negative disemployment effect for that particular event. You know, concluding that it just doesn't mean that the minimum wage has no negative effect in recession. I don't think I would go that far, but you know, strong evidence on that, it's still I think it's still required.
Okay. A question, I might have missed it, but do you find any effects on margins other than employment, changes in non-wage benefits, working hours worked, and things like that by Hans Genberg?
Basically, in this paper, we, you know, and in the CPS, you know, we kind of measure this. So the data, we don't want to push. As I said, you could go to look at the effects on other outcomes. We applying different data, but we didn't want it to push that direction because we thought it will be very much tangent to this analysis. Separate paper will be interesting. But basically, you know, we have the overtime share, which is kind of like how much you have to work overtime or in response to minimum wage. That's what we have, like like you could say, like it's a benefit. You know, part-time share again, like can be something like that. But in the current population, right, you don't have a lot of variables where you could look at like change in healthcare benefits, this kind of stuff. So we don't really look at that directly. So the short answer is that this paper is not about that. You could apply, I think, the machine learning approach and use it and look at specifically to that, and I think it will be very interesting follow-up, but we didn't do that here.
Okay, the next question is going to be more my personal interest. I was hoping, or maybe expecting, you know, the macro labor literature has been showing in the past decade a big effect coming on aggregate shocks in terms of in response to macro shocks, big effect coming from participation margin. You know, we usually think in terms of unemployment, employment wages, but you know, these people who are meant to be inactive, not in labor force, they are also responding to these economic shocks by entering or exiting labor force, for example. It's a big thing in macro, but you couldn't find much. When minimum goes up.
Our motivation was exactly like talking directly to that, not exactly the macro literature, but macro labor literature talking about minimum wages, where this margin is super important. Yeah. So when you have you know, like a macro search paper, if you want to have no disemployment effect of the minimum wage, then you have to have a change in the search effort, and then you have to mean that some people have to brought in to participation, and there will be some people who might search harder and unemployed became more likely to employed. So there you should see some job-to-job flow change and participation. And you know, we thought like that will be like the punchline. Like, look, we have these models and explanations, and these are really great. And you know, we kind of provide some direct evidence on these job-to-job transitions, on unemployment to employment transitions, on participation, and you can see we didn't find anything.
Yeah, I see. No, I mean, I guess you know, job search intensity was the next thing. You know, I was thinking, but you know, the New York Fed has got some interesting survey on that. I wonder if some of those surveys were conducted around the changes in some of the minimum wage changes that in your data.
Paper studying search effort directly using a much more limited data. You know, here the advantage that we can use it 172 events with big periods, like lots of events. But you are right that there are literature, particularly one paper looking at the change in search effort search effort in response to minimum wage. They use CPS, and I think they also use the American Time Use Survey, where it's a more limited period. I think they only have 10 years, or I think they started in 2000 or something. They don't apply our algorithms. So the problem, so it's a very nice paper in some way, because I think they directly look at search effort, but they don't only focus on the search effort of the highly probability group, you know. So they compare the search effort of everyone in the economy, the search effort of everyone so search effort of everyone in the economy in treated states, and the search effort to everyone in the economy non-treated states. But you know, it's impossible to find anything with this, because most of the workers are not minimum wage workers and doesn't care about, like, my search effort won't change by the minimum wage. And like most of the people in the economy is like that. Like, you know, minimum wage workers are less than 15%. US 2010% of the economy. They won't change their search behavior, most of the people. And then this is a very underpowered exercise. So if you combine our one, where you're basically really focusing on those which are likely to be minimum wage workers, then you might have a chance to find a positive search effort effect, but we didn't find. Okay, so that's the thing here, that even if you focus on the high probability group where lots of workers are affected, there is no clear evidence on changing search effort in the CPS. And yeah,
I don't know why my fellow organizers, Hans and Ellie and other colleagues are sending their questions in the chat button. Please feel free to unmute yourself or turn your cameras on. But there is a great question from Ellie. Obviously, he read your QJE paper. He says, in QJE paper, Attila looked at tradable versus non-tradable goods sectors. Presumably, workers in services are more likely to be affected. Did you look at that again in this paper with machine learning?
No, we didn't. We could, yeah, I think at some point we were producing some evidence, but I'm not sure we included it just because it didn't fit in the paper. I mean, we have too long. We have to cut because we were too long. Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, my recollection is that probably we don't do it here.
Okay, there are final 3 questions, if I may convey them to you.
Yeah, we don't do it here.
One of them is, can you explain how you choose threshold for high recall limit? That's one.
Oh, it's yeah, it's pretty ad hoc. You know, I mean, we produce this graph. I mean, this graph is, you know, basically show the estimated effect for different thresholds. So I think we are pretty transparent what would be your story if you have a different threshold. And I think we kind of write it to have a, so the reason why we looked at this particle high probability limit, I think was that, yeah, let me. I mean, the high definitely we choose to get. I mean, we wanted to have like, say, like, okay, 75% of the workforce. So high recall group is like 75% of all the minimum wage workers are we capture, and we thought like, okay, we cannot go 100% because then, you know, everybody will be included in the sample, but you know, 75% is pretty large share, and I think it's meaningful to say something about them. So about the high recall, high probability limit, I think here we wanted to be as close to the original Card and Kruger, where they also have a high probability group. But to tell you the truth, I don't exactly remember why we picked up exactly that number there, the 35% and the 60% precision. I think it, yeah. It's some coming, you know, we wanted to be close to the original Card and Kruger, and they report a high probability, and we wanted to be very close to that, and that's why we kind of that's why we ended up using that threshold. But the exact how we get exactly to that now, I can't remember.
I think because we are sort of 16-17 minutes over time, I think we should cut it here, and it's getting also late in the region. If I may conclude with one interesting finding from some of my former colleagues in New Zealand, people like Dean Hislop, what they found with New Zealand data when they merged it with some educational data, they found some increase whenever teenagers were affected in terms of employment. Their tertiary education enrollment rates were increasing, i.e. if they lost their jobs, they were going to university or some kind of community college or polytechnic. I guess those kind of things, being able to answer those kind of things would depend on whether one has data on these issues. Attila, thank you very much for your time, and we really appreciate it. As I said, we are a macro crowd. This is something different, but given the importance of the issue, from many aspects, distributional, even also from the macro perspectives, in terms of the role it might play in the US inflation and what that might do to the Fed policy and the emerging markets. It might be a bit stretching, but they are all related to us. We really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And my colleagues from the Asia School of Business, SEACEN, and also our participants, thank you very much for sending your questions. Much appreciated. My apologies if I couldn't sort of convey your questions to Attila. I tried as much as I could, given time constraints. Thank you very much. Please join us on the 28th for the next ASBxSEACEN seminar by Shangjin Wei from Colombia. Attila, thank you very much again. We really appreciate it. Stay safe.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention and staying up so late. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.